Hey, before you read about it on Facebook or Twitter, well, hear about it from your friends. Find out what today's big stories really mean with me, Sean Hannity, today at 2, right here on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. And a renowned Russian studies professor, Stephen F. Cohen, who was at Princeton and NYU, was on with Tucker Carlson the other day. We just need to revisit what he said in the wake of what was bandied about by Adam Schiff over the weekend. Stephen Cohen on the two foundational documents used as the basis for the FBI's investigation, beginning with obtaining that FISA warrant.
There are two documents that became the foundational sources for the Kremlin-Gate narrative. It was first the Steele dossier, which surely informed the so-called intelligence community assessment in January of 2017. We were told that was the judgment of 17 intelligence agencies. It now turns out to have been the judgment of no intelligence agencies, just a few guys at the top. So that is all that's ever been produced, and it's not credible.
So that's Stephen Cohen, who, by the way, is a contributor to outlets like The Nation. This is not some Trump flack or conservative. And here's Adam Schiff on Face the Nation, complaining about Trump not greenlighting the release of his memo after the House Intel Committee did. And I agree that his memo should come out at some point. If there really are sources and methods, problems with it, then fine, correct them, and then get the memo out and let's hash it out. But the other thing he said, in spite of everything we know, and people that used to be with the agency commenting on what's been put into the public arena, and experts in the field like Stephen Cohen, Professor Cohen talking about it, here's what Adam Schiff said about his assessment of the FBI's behavior throughout the Kremlin-Gate investigation, as Cohen called it.
Is it your representation to the nation, sir, that everything that the FBI did in the process of obtaining that surveillance warrant on Carter Page absolutely followed proper protocol, every evidentiary standard was met, and there was nothing askew about that warrant ever?
Major, there's nothing askew about that warrant that I can see. And if the Republicans were really concerned about this, because everything that I have seen, the FBI acted completely appropriately, they would have invited the FBI before our committee, as I urged them to do.
For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by investigative journalist Sharyl Attkisson. She's the author of the new book, The Smear: How Shady Political Operatives and Fake News Control What You See, What You Think, and How You Vote. Sharyl, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So what about Schiff's pronouncement this weekend? That's a big claim in light of everything we understand to be true about the information provided by FBI to the FISA court for that warrant and what they knew at the time of providing that information.
Well, I have my information from research from the FBI's own files and from insiders involved in this process, not the specific one, but the general process of FISA, who say Schiff is absolutely wrong. I don't know if he's even researched it enough to know or if he's just spinning, but it doesn't matter how much the court relied upon the dossier or parts of the dossier or other things. According to these experts and their own policy called Woods procedure, the FBI may not submit a single unvetted or unverified fact to the court, period, because it's such an intrusion on Americans' privacy to get a wiretap. There are strict procedures designed to prevent abuse. They may not present a single fact that they have not personally identified and verified before the court. We know for a fact they did this at least. So therefore, according to insiders and their own policy, it appears as though they violated it pretty blatantly.
Well, why are the Democrats so sloppy with their memo compared to what Republicans presented? I mean, theirs is 10 pages, Republicans is 6, but you think that they purposely put information in there that should have been redacted in order to make President Trump look bad?
It's hard to say, and I haven't seen the memo, but I think they're in sort of a panic mode, especially inside the intelligence agencies in some corners, not just the FBI, by the way, but the NSA as well, because they know bits of what they've been doing the past 10 to 20 years beneath the radar without the American public knowing is coming to be revealed. And again, insiders have told me this is not the only time bad information has gone before the court, the FISA court. In fact, there's a record of it. That's why these Woods procedures were installed in the first place. And I said to one of my sources, well, I assume that means accidentally the court has been provided with bad information. And the person said, not always inadvertently. So, this is a court that has very little. It's supposed to have a lot of oversight and checks and balances, but in reality, the way it operates, it has very little. It's almost a rubber stamp. And again, I was told before President Trump ever ran for office that some bad actors have been using the court, bringing bad information to the court, knowing it will never be examined because it was not to be used in a prosecution in a court of law. This information was used to get wiretaps for political purposes or dirt purposes or blackmail purposes, so no one would ever see the basis of the wiretaps. And so these insiders say there have been abuses going on for a long time.
The D.C. press corps and Democrats are focused on the Nunes memo and Nunes specifically, trying to discredit him. But at the same time, and Andy McCarthy points this out over the weekend in National Review, the Chuck Grassley-Lindsey Graham memo, which affirms the Nunes memo in many respects, has been just kind of totally ignored. McCarthy writing, the Obama Justice Department and FBI used anonymously sourced Clinton campaign-generated innuendo to convince the FISA court to issue surveillance warrants against Carter Page, and in doing so, they concealed the Clinton campaign's role. This was confirmed in the Graham memo, and it's been underreported to the extent it's been reported at all from certain outlets.
That's true, and the Grassley memo highlights something else, which I think is a big story. They referred criminal charges to the FBI, the Grassley Committee, against the author of the dossier, the so-called the anti-Trump opposition research, Christopher Steele. But the FBI used Steele's material to get the wiretap. So they're referring to the very body accused of wrongdoing to investigate the guy that body relied on. So this is fraught with conflicts of interest. And I asked some staffers, well, if there was a violation of policy or law, but you're asking the people who did it to investigate themselves and there's no other choice, where does this go? And they're really grappling with that because there's no answer to that right now.
Do you think Carter Page and President Trump were vindicated by the Nunes memo?
Well, I'm not sure there's ever been any evidence against President Trump doing anything directly. So I guess he needed vindication in the sense that there have been wild accusations in the press. And there certainly was nothing in the Nunes memo that verified anything, quite the opposite. Carter Page, I don't know enough about all of his details, but it looks to me like the man was hounded by 4 wiretaps, which I'm told is pretty unusual when they're not turning up evidence of criminal activity, to keep reapplying and getting them over and over unless they're trying to catch people in an ancillary sense through his wiretap. And he's the best they could do. But this guy was never ultimately charged with anything. So it does, in a sense, almost vindicate him, unless there's something we don't know. If he doesn't seem to be working behind the scenes with the FBI, he's done interviews. But unless there's something we don't know, yes, I would say he's been vindicated.
It was interesting you're talking about how kind of the FBI or people in the intelligence community worried about revelations of how they've been operating for some time, not just in this case. Andy McCarthy, going back to him, has suggested this specific case was always about protecting President Obama and his email exchanges with Hillary Clinton, and essentially, you weaponized FBI, DOJ, the intelligence community to support that mission. But Stephen Cohen, going back to the Russian studies professor, he kind of posited, tongue-in-cheek, an interesting question. He's like, how many branches of government do we have these days? Because I was always taught we have 3, essentially suggesting it seems to me that we have at least 4 now, with the 4th being the intelligence community, the quote-unquote deep state. How do you suss this out? Do you think this is the intelligence community covering themselves in this specific case, or it's much bigger than that and they're worried about scrutiny for how some within their ranks have acted in a number of cases over an extended period of time looking back?
I think it's the latter. And I've posited, based on evidence sources and what we've seen so far, my working theory is what they did during campaign 2016 wasn't so much about hating Trump politically. Remember, he's really not all that different from other politicians in terms of the positions he takes, even though it's portrayed that way. It's more about he was the wild card that could bring in officials, or might bring in officials, who would peel back and expose this bureaucracy that's developed, this sort of secret layer that's been used politically against journalists and members of Congress on both teams, by the way, Democrats and Republicans. This is something that surpasses party politics, and that this could be discovered. But it wouldn't be if someone like Jeb Bush got elected or even if Hillary Clinton got elected, but it might be under Trump. This is what panicked them. Not only had they used these tools against Trump associates and perhaps Trump himself, but the reasons that they did this was to make sure he couldn't discover the bigger picture, which involved even, as you know, the federal lawsuit I have for the government intrusions on my computers.
Mm-hmm.
This was not an anomaly. I think this was more common than people understand against, again, American citizens, journalists, and politicians in a way that you guys know. This is almost supposed to never happen, a wiretap on a U.S. citizen like that. You know, they're supposed to only be done under very careful circumstances. The so-called incidental collection, if they're listening to one person, they pick up another American citizen, used to be you should just destroy the information. Well, they started saving it. Then they were going to save it but not have names attached to it. Well, then they started unmasking the names. I mean, this has been a real slippery slope, we've learned.
Well, Sharyl, remind our listeners, what exactly did they do to you? What happened?
Well, around 2013, I was notified by some Intel-connected officials that I was likely being monitored by the government for the work that I was doing, reporting on government things, you know, and it sounded crazy at the time because Edward Snowden hadn't even come out yet. But through government-related forensics experts, and now we've had at least 7 forensics experts part of my lawsuit or analyses, we confirmed a fairly long-term government intrusion on my computers that included keystroke monitoring, capturing my passwords, someone planting classified documents deep in my operating system, using Skype to exfiltrate files. Believe it or not, they can activate Skype without you knowing it and listen in on your audio, what you're doing in the room. It was very extensive, and the forensic evidence is like a fingerprint. We can tell it was proprietary to a government agency. They at times used something called a BGAN satellite terminal to get into my files and to exfiltrate. So, again, forensically, we are ironclad, and we have this federal lawsuit going, but we're trying to get the names of the people who launched these zero-day attacks and the illegal bulk collection, how it was used. But the Department of Justice isn't cooperating. We've got subpoenas out at all the intelligence agencies right now.
Yeah, it's the mistakes were made, kind of. Yeah, very interesting. I mean, and James Rosen, too, is another case of this, so it's not isolated. It's fascinating and frightening at the same time. She is Sharyl Attkisson, investigative journalist. The book, got to pick this up, The Smear, How Shady Political Operatives and Fake News Control What You See, What You Think, and How You Vote. Sharyl, thanks again for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This only